and I happen to be responsible for a constituency where Timberley is within the urban core, and those particular roads and streets are taken care of by the city. And then we have the more rural areas, the Prospect area. I'm aware of the fact that outside of the urban core, we must make close attention to secondary roads in more rural communities. That's the root of tourism. That's the root of making sure that commercial development is going to happen. I want the member opposite to know that whether it's in the Brooklyn area, whether it's in the Timberley Prospect area, your road issues are being addressed. They'll be addressed in a timely fashion, in a fair fashion, and an open fashion, and hopefully you'll be satisfied with the 5-year plan. But thank you for the question.
The honourable member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal. Mr. Speaker, it has been well publicized that the Minister of Finance has directed all other ministers to provide a 1% reduction on staff and operation in each department. My question to the Minister, has he achieved this target, and if so, where has he had to cut in order to reach the goal directed to him by the Minister of Finance?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Mr. The member from Richmond is helping me out through this. I thank the member for the question, and one of the concerns, of course, we have to make sure, particularly in the Department of Transportation and the number of people that are employed, huge department, it's important that the people who are delivering the services firsthand to Nova Scotians, those are the folks that we must rely upon, whether they're plow operators in the wintertime or people who work with us in the summertime and the spring and fall of the year. I want to make it very clear that when the Department of Transportation is looking at making budget decisions, the decisions are based upon the fact of the service level that we...
Order, please. The time for oral question period has expired. The honourable member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, during question period, I know that you, and you didn't give the reason why, maybe you could now, you had ruled that a question was out of order and moved on to the next speaker. I wonder, first of all, if you could explain why, Mr. Speaker, and the second thing is, if it was something you deemed was unparliamentary, I respect that, and I would just ask in the future that you consider either ask the member to retract a certain word or statement, if that's what it was, and allow the question to continue, or if you at least explain to us why you did it, and if you would consider that for the future.
Thank you. Well, I guess I felt at the time the question was inappropriate. Some of the language was even bordering on unparliamentary. Words such as baby minister and deceitful, I think was the other word I heard there. So I just felt that was inappropriate, and perhaps the right thing is to ask the minister to rephrase the question at the time, but at the moment I decided it was inappropriate. I moved on to the next question. The honourable member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to point out for your information, you did allow the question to be repeated. The member got back up and asked the same question. He left a word out. And again, if you're going to point out that there's a word that's unparliamentary, I'd ask the future at least tell the member that it's unparliamentary and ask to reword it, and at least allow him to ask the question.
No,
thank you.
Point well taken. I'll take that into consideration. Okay, thank you. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call private and local bills for second reading?
Private and local bills for second reading.
Could you please call Bill number 43, the Congregation of the Baptist Church of Kennard?
Bill number 43. The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on the second reading of Bill 43. The name of the bill is an act to amend Chapter 6 of the Acts of 1844, an act to authorize the Congregation of the Baptist Church at Kennard in Cornwallis to appoint trustees to take charge of the said church and cemetery adjoining the same, and to enclose and ornament the same. It's a long name, and I think it's somewhat fitting, actually, that it's got a long name because the cemetery has a very long history. It was actually, this act was proclaimed, as the bill suggests, in 1844, 166 years ago. And I think it occurred with the foresight of the congregation of the church and those who prepared the framework for the cemetery. Many of the congregation at that time would have been descendants of New England planters, and who I think as a population took a keen interest in regulations and order. And in fact, their settlement here in Nova Scotia gave them some entitlement to the rule of law. It's probably fitting too that this bill is being suggested for amendment this year, because 2010 marks the 250th anniversary of the arrival of the first New England planters in Nova Scotia. And many of those people actually settled in what became known as the township of Cornwallis. And that's where the First Cornwallis Baptist Church is located. The church is actually situated on the corner of Middledyke Road and Kennard Street in Kings County. And for those of you in this house who aren't so familiar with the area, that would be almost in the center of Kings North, the riding that I represent. And it's near a very impressive crop of blueberries known as Blueberry Acres, which I would welcome you to have a look at sometime in late August or early September. It's a wonderful experience. And it's about a stone's throw from Sheffield Mills, which is the home of Eagle Watch, a February holiday which brings hundreds, if not thousands, of people from Nova Scotia and probably across the world to look at hundreds of bald eagles. And one of the really impressive things about that particular event, because I think it stimulates the winter economy, are the number of cameras and expensive photographic equipment that people bring there. So I think it's just one of those things that drives our economy. The cemetery and a great pancake breakfast, I'm hearing one of my colleagues say, and it is delicious, although probably not good for our cholesterol levels. The cemetery itself is located across the road, as we would say in the country, from the church. It's been lovingly groomed by members of the congregation through the fund that they've set up for more than a century and a half. And if you're standing in the cemetery and looking off to the southwest, you get a panoramic view of the marshlands, which give you a good sense of what the Annapolis Valley looks like at its most beautiful. And to the southwest, it looks off across farms and homes toward Kentville. The church, the cemetery, and in fact, Kennard, Upper Kennard and Lower Kennard might be one of the most beautiful parts of the beautiful Annapolis Valley. And of course, if you'd like to see that location, you don't have to wait for next year's Eagle Watch. We're just on the cusp of the Apple Blossom Festival, one of the largest parades in Eastern Canada, and I'd welcome all the members of the House to come out and participate in that. Some will, I know. Over the years, this act that I'm speaking of today has been amended several times as circumstances and needs have changed. A primary purpose of the existing act is to manage an investment trust fund, and the interest of the fund is reserved for the purpose of maintaining the cemetery. So the situation that the board of the church finds itself in at this time is that over the years, the board has been a careful steward of the funds that it's had at its disposal. And probably 20 or more years ago, the board made some very wise investments, which have grown significantly. So at this point, the interest available now far exceeds the requirements for actually maintaining the cemetery, which is a problem that the church has decided to deal with, and a very interesting, and in fact I would say a positive problem to have. The trustees and the congregation of Cornwallis Baptist have developed and agreed upon ideas about how to better utilize the resources the trust fund provides. The changes proposed in this amendment to the Act enable the trustees of the cemetery to use 80% of the surplus income from the trust funds held for the operation of the cemetery for charitable purposes, whereas in the past all of the funds were intended to be used for the cemetery upkeep itself. And it also, as an additional function in this amendment, clarifies the specific membership of the Board of Trustees so that the right people are there. In their consideration of these proposed amendments, the church has been conscious that it is a steward for a resource that could be effectively utilized for the good of the community it serves. The church believes that the surplus now existing in the cemetery fund should be used to quote from their language, in the spirit of Christian charity and not for the benefit of church operating expenses. But it is also, and wisely I think, committed to the maintenance and growth of the trust it administers. First Cornwallis Baptist Church and its pastor, Reverend Dr. Peter Lonis, have been leaders in recognizing the needs of those who are most disadvantaged in the areas of Kennard and Canning and beyond. They have seen the problems of hunger, of problems with home heating, and social exclusion. And Dr. Lonis himself has worked to bring members of the religious and wider communities together to consider solutions to these problems. The amendments proposed in this bill are examples of this leadership. They're an illustration, I think, of the generosity of the members of the First Cornwallis Baptist Church. And they are also, I think these amendments are, a creative means of preserving the cemetery and the heritage and the beauty of the area while reaching out to address the needs of the living. So I stand here, Mr. Speaker, pleased and proud to have introduced this bill. I hope that we'll have the support of the whole House. I know that its success will be a credit to the membership of the First Cornwallis Baptist Church, and it will make an important contribution to the welfare of the communities that I'm fortunate enough to represent. So thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to speak on this bill. So I move second reading of the of Bill number 43.
Thank you. There are further speakers? The motion is for second reading on Bill number 43, Congregation of the Baptist Church at Kennard. Is the House ready for the question? Question has been called. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Against? Motion carried.
Bill 43 entitled An Act to amend Chapter 6 of the Acts of 1844, an act to authorize the congregation of the Baptist Church at Kennard in Cornwallis to appoint trustees to take charge of the said church and cemetery adjoining the same and to enclose and ornament the same.
Thank you. Order that this bill be referred to the Committee on Private and Local Bills. The Honourable, the Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, could you please call private local bills for second reading? Bill number 49, the Royal Cape Breton Yacht Club.
Private and local bills for second reading. Bill number 49, the Royal Cape Breton Yacht Club. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton South.
Mr. Speaker, I'm tempted to regale the House about the exploits of the Royal Cape Breton Yacht Club for the past 100 years, but I think I'll probably save that for another day. And I know that it would be very interesting for everybody, but today I'm just going to move the bill, Bill number 49, the Royal Cape Breton Yacht Club, for second reading. Thank you very much.
Question has been called. The motion is for second reading on Bill number 49. Is the House ready for the question? Question has been called. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Against? Motion carried.
Bill 49, title An Act to amend Chapter 283 of the Acts of 1903, an act to incorporate the Royal Cape Breton Yacht Club.
Order that this bill be referred to the Committee on Private and Local Bills. The Honourable, the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call bills for public bills for second reading?
Public bills for second reading.
Could you please call Bill number 22, the Security and Investigative Service Act?
Bill number 22, the Honourable, the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased today to ask the support of this important piece of legislation, an act respecting the provisions of security services and investigative services. The private security industry plays a valuable role in safeguarding life and property and enhancing public safety and security in Nova Scotia. The Department of Justice is responsible for regulating and monitoring the private security industry in the province to ensure the safety interests of the general public are protected. Mr. Speaker, here in Nova Scotia, the existing Private Investigators and Private Guards Act has not been amended in more than 35 years. It only requires private guards and private investigators for hire to be licensed. There is also no training requirements under the existing legislation. Governments are accountable to citizens to ensure that such legislation provides for overall public safety and meets the private security needs of the general public. This bill will repeal and replace the existing Private Investigators and Private Guards Act. Security guards, private investigators, and other individuals offering protection services to Nova Scotians should be screened, licensed, and properly trained in their duties. This bill will do that. I will expand coverage to include in-house security guards and private investigators who interact with the public as well as bouncers, bodyguards, and the Canadian Corps of Commissionaires. Mr. Speaker, in recent years, we have heard about incidents in our bars where patrons have been injured and where private security guards themselves have been injured. The inclusion of mandatory training in this bill will ensure individuals have the knowledge and skills to perform their duties to better protect themselves and the citizens of Nova Scotia. Security personnel will also benefit. This bill will introduce portable individual licenses. If individuals meet all licensing requirements, they will be able to manage their own licenses and change employers without having to reapply for a new license and pay for another licensing fee. Portable licensing will create a pool of licensed individuals who will be available to work immediately, allowing companies to fulfill contracts and carry on business in a competitive market. The bill will also include introduction of code of conduct and establishes a formal regime for investigation, inspections, and complaints and appeals. There are about 3,800 licensed security personnel in Nova Scotia now, and we expect that will grow significantly once additional security sectors are regulated. This bill will bring Nova Scotians into line with other Canadian provinces such as British Columbia, Alberta, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, which have introduced similar legislation. Mr. Speaker, this legislation is several years in the making. In 2007, staff at the Department of Justice began consulting with stakeholders by distributing a discussion paper and holding a series of meetings allowing Nova Scotians to have input. In the spring of 2009, the proposed bill was posted on the department's website, allowing further input that is reflected in legislation I introduced today. And once this bill is passed, the Department of Justice will be consulting with the industry once again as we develop standards and draft regulations. Input from security industry is not only valuable, it is necessary for ensuring that we get these regulations right for Nova Scotia business and right for public safety. Mr. Speaker, I believe the new bill will provide an up-to-date regulatory framework which will increase public confidence in the level of professionalism of private security industry. It will also reduce the opportunities for criminal activity to take place. In closing, I urge the members to support this bill so that we can get on with developing these important regulations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The honourable member for Richmond.
Thank you, Speaker. As the justice critic for the official opposition, I'm pleased to rise and make a few remarks in regards to Bill 22, the Security and Investigative Services Act. Mr. Speaker, this legislation and the intent of this legislation is very familiar to our caucus. As you'll recall, our colleague from Halifax, Clayton Park, had introduced legislation on this very issue a few years ago. And it was in response to some of the events which had taken place, especially here in Metro, where there were some unfortunate incidents involving private security guards. In fact, I'm sure the member for Halifax Clayton Park will remind us of the stabbing that did take place following a youth dance at the old Halifax Forum. And the very serious injuries that were encountered as a result, which did raise the issue of what training is made available to private security guards here in Nova Scotia, only to find out that at the time there was very little training, that there was only a licensing requirement. The Minister has indicated it's been almost 35 years since there has been a review and an update of the legislation relating to security and investigative services here in the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, the bill that has been tabled by the government in many ways mirrors the legislation that was brought in by my colleague from Halifax Clayton Park, so we're certainly pleased to see that legislation is moving. In fact, the legislation that my colleague from Halifax Clayton Park had introduced a few years ago did get second reading, and unfortunately it died a natural death on the order paper and did not proceed any further than that. Mr. Speaker, one of the issues I wanted to raise, which was brought to my attention by counsel for one of the largest employers in Nova Scotia, is the issue of how this will impact in-house security.
Now, in-house security, Mr. Speaker, is, for example, some of our large employers here in the province have their own security personnel which they use. Now, the definition in the legislation says that if those security personnel have any interaction with the public, they need to fall under the provisions of this Act. The argument that is being made by at least one of our largest employers in the province, which I am suspecting may be showing up at the law amendments process, is that, look, for the most part, our security personnel only deal with our employees. Now, is it possible they will deal with the public? Very rarely, but it is possible. Someone could be dropping off a resume, someone could be delivering something to the place of employment, and therefore, technically, they are dealing with members of the public. But for the most part, their job is to deal with the staff of that specific workplace. So I know that they do have some concerns there. I'm hoping that the minister will be open to hearing those concerns and seeing what possible amendments could be put in place so that we are not unnecessarily adding regulatory burden to employers in Nova Scotia, especially at a time when we are talking about reducing red tape. I would certainly hope that the government is not looking at putting unnecessary burdens on some of our largest employers in dealing with their own in-house security staff. Mr. Speaker, the minister has indicated that this will now apply to bouncers, bodyguards, commissionaires, investigators, and it's amazing that we've allowed ourselves in this province to go this long without ensuring that these individuals practicing this profession are not receiving mandatory levels of training. Mr. Speaker, the minister has highlighted some of the issues that has happened, especially in downtown and in other licensed establishments where either the bouncers themselves have been injured or that they unfortunately have caused injury to other parties. And I can tell you, having gone to university here in the city and having frequented downtown, you quickly see that when there is incidents, these bouncers have little to no time to react. From the time that they encounter someone who is creating a disruption to the time that person is outside on the street is a matter of seconds. It's not a matter where they get to have a chit-chat with the person and get to have a discussion. They have to react very quickly. And in doing so, they have to make decisions which I'm sure upon review may not have been the best decision. But hopefully with this mandatory training, it will give them the opportunity to have the necessary skills in dealing with what is clearly very difficult situations, because especially for bouncers, in many cases, the individuals they're dealing with have consumed significant amounts of alcohol, which makes it for that much more of a difficult situation, which I'm sure that the Minister of Justice, with his background, would have probably had significant experience in as well. So any training that can be made available there certainly is going to be welcome in assisting them in carrying out their duties and assisting the public who frequent establishments and have to have contact with either bouncers, bodyguards, commissionaires, or others. Certainly the issue of the licensing being portable, I think, is very valuable, because I know in smaller communities, for example, some of the establishments, if they're holding special events, they will only hire bouncers for those special events. They're not people they keep on staff. They're not people that they can provide employment on a regular basis. But on the odd occasion when they are doing an event, they call upon these bouncers. I think certainly it would be a reduction in red tape having the license portable so that these establishments don't have to apply, or the individual being hired as a bouncer doesn't have to apply to get a license for every single event. So certainly I think that that's going to be a welcome addition and will reduce some of the regulatory burden involved with that. Mr. Speaker, when you hear the figure of 3,800 Nova Scotians who are hired within these professions, it's certainly an indication of the amount of people that rely upon this for their employment and practice in this profession. So the minister has indicated that with the new rules, he expects there might be even more that will be registering, especially with the fact that their licenses will be portable, and we will see in good time whether those numbers do increase. But I wanted to take this opportunity again, Mr. Speaker, to thank my colleague, from Halifax Clayton Park, because had she not brought this forward to start off with, I'm not sure if the discussion would have taken place, which has led to Bill number 22 being brought forward here. Unfortunately, when my colleague from Halifax Clayton Park did bring it forward, it was while in opposition, while in fact in a third party at the time and under a minority government where no bills were assured easy passage in the House. But we now have a bill that's being presented by a majority government who clearly do have the numbers to be able to make this bill go forward through the legislative process, and I'm certainly hopeful that that will take place. But prior to that, I'm certainly hopeful that the minister will be open to any potential amendments which may come during the allow amendments stage, of which he is the chairman, which I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, in my 12 plus years in this chamber, I believe I've been a member of law amendments for those 12 years. We have seen many great ideas come forward by presenters, many practical suggestions which have been adopted by the governments of the day. It certainly worked very well under a minority situation, in the fact that the two opposition parties could vote together to make amendments to the bill. So I'm certainly hopeful. I didn't get much of a chance in the fall to assist in the law amendments process, but I'm certainly hopeful that during this session that the government will be open to friendly amendments to their legislation, whether it's on Bill 22 or whether it's on other pieces of legislation, because the law amendment system does work. We'd only hope that there'd be better ways of notifying Nova Scotians of this. Unfortunately, many are not aware of legislation that is going through this chamber and the impacts on them, but we do still have a number of individuals and groups who do make it a point to come and share with us their concerns and their positive suggestions regarding legislation, and I have no doubt that Bill number 22 will probably attract a number of presenters as well. So with that, Mr. Speaker, again, I commend my colleague for Halifax Clayton Park for having brought this issue forward, created a debate on the matter, and brought forward legislation, which I agree with the Minister of Justice. I believe it will be a positive step and a move in the right direction for our province. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I thank you for the opportunity to make those comments.
Thank you. The honourable member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to begin by the honourable member for Richmond mentioned he wasn't able to take part in a lot of the process in the fall, and I know he was preoccupied, I believe, with an addition to his house. So I think on the behalf of all the members here, we all want to say congratulations, but we're also hoping the honourable member is getting some more longer night's sleep, hopefully these days. And anyway, it's good to see him. Good to see him with us. Mr. Speaker, in seriousness, I want to first of all congratulate the minister for bringing forward Bill number 22. And I remember when the member for Halifax Clayton Park actually brought the issue before the House, and as a result of issues that happened in HRM, and I want to congratulate her as well for that initiative at the time. And I want to congratulate the minister. This bill reminds me a lot, when I listen to the minister speak, reminds me a lot of what, when you look at other enforcement agencies in the province of Nova Scotia, land in Canada, it reminds me of those a number of years, how it evolved from basically police officers in Nova Scotia many years ago. When you were sworn as a police officer, you received a gun and a badge, and you were basically told to go out and do the job. And it's gone from that, fortunately, today, where we have, I believe, some of those highly skilled, trained, professional police officers in this country, right here in this province, as a result of very, very good training. It's available at the Atlantic Police Academy, and obviously through the Royal Canadian Mounted Police depot training out in the western part of our country in Saskatchewan, Regina. This bill, Mr. Speaker, is certainly a step in the right direction. It's a good bill. There are a couple of things that I'm hoping that the Department of Justice will have a look at. I know, Mr. Speaker, at second reading, I'm not allowed to go through each part of this bill. But there are a couple of things I wanted to highlight. As I read through the bill, I noticed that there's talk about volunteer organizations who have people doing voluntary security work for them. And I'll use a good example of Legions. When Legions in Nova Scotia have events and they have to hire or put in place even volunteers, individuals who will do security work for them, there's going to be a concern with them, as I know there will be with small bars, for example, throughout the province in regards to the cost of training and the ability to allow staff to actually leave their employed to take advantage of the training. So I hope, Mr. Speaker, the Department of Justice will look at, when they do the regulations, I'm sure there's going to be some fees attached to this licensing. I'm hoping they'll give consideration to allowing some of those fees collected to be considered available for those who will be placed at a disadvantage in regards to trying to find resources and the time for their staff to take advantage of this training. Now, just back to the Legions, I noticed in here that they talk about those who are volunteering their time. There's some exemptions available. I also want to raise the issue of, for example, of search and rescues. I know in my own area, search and rescue organizations provide a tremendous amount of support services for organizations in the community, particularly police departments when it comes to security issues. And I'm hoping that, again, the Department of Justice will ensure that there's no additional burden placed on these organizations as they try to provide a very valuable service to the community. Mr. Speaker, I'd be interested to know as well, the Minister talked about consultation that's taken place over the last 3 years in the Department of Justice and the communities throughout Nova Scotia. I'm hoping the Minister can provide us with some indication of who those organizations were that actually made representation to the Department, what type of consultation was held with them, and what their suggestions or recommendations were. And in fact, if those recommendations and suggestions are reflected in this legislation. Mr. Speaker, there is an issue of rural versus urban. When you have large organizations in the rural and urban area where they have the ability to place men or women in training, take advantage of training that's available, and have other people prepared and able to take their places as compared to maybe in rural areas where maybe there may only be one individual who's working for or volunteering for an organization where they may not have that luxury. So I'm hoping the Department will consider that as well. And I'm hoping, Mr. Speaker, that the Restaurant and Bar Association of this province, who represents businesses from the large and small in this province, I'm hoping that they'll have had an opportunity, if they don't prior to this bill, certainly I'm sure they will at law amendments, to have their input in regards to this bill, because I believe it will have a tremendous impact, Mr. Speaker, on this bill. A couple other things, Mr. Speaker. The bill talks about those who apply and then who end up actually being have a license and possibly end up with their license either suspended or taken away. Mr. Speaker, I noticed in the bill there doesn't seem to be there's an opportunity for the register to refuse or to renew a bill. A license, and I understand that. There's also an opportunity for a review. I understand that. But one thing I don't see in here, Mr. Speaker, is whether there's actual documentation shared with the individual to show to them, prove to them, why in fact they are being suspended or not being allowed to renew their license. And I think that's very important, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that someone who is placed in this situation, that they be given the opportunity to have full documentation in regards to what information has been used to either suspend or to refuse to renew that license. Mr. Speaker, again, this is a good bill. There are lots of opportunity in this to make our community safer, to offer opportunity for those who want to take part in these professions in regards to security and obviously investigative services to be better enhanced with good training. I'm very supportive. I know our caucuses of not only training but especially education, Mr. Speaker. I think a lot of times over the years education would have helped a lot in regards to some of the issues we've seen in that respect throughout Nova Scotia. I'm hoping, Mr. Speaker, that the Department of Justice and the Minister will consider some of the thoughts from this side of the House. And obviously, Mr. Speaker, it's a bill that we'll support going to law amendments. I do look forward to those who are most affected in the industry coming forward with law amendments and sharing their views. And I, like my colleague from Richmond, really hope the Minister of Justice and the Department will give full consideration to those suggestions made by those individuals. Mr. Speaker, I know that. Is she speaking? Okay, Mr. Speaker, those few comments. So I'll now take my place, and we look forward to passage of this with our support of this side of the House. Two law amendments.
Diana speaking.
2 law amendments for further consideration. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The honourable member from Halifax, Clayton Park.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased today to have a chance to speak a little bit on second reading of Bill 22, which is an act respecting the provision of security services and investigative services. And as was mentioned by a couple of the other members here, I had originally brought in a bill that had a similar intent, although it was more streamlined, and as was mentioned, it was brought in when of course, we were in opposition, as I still am. But even as a bill coming as a private member's bill in opposition, it did receive second reading, and that was in November of 2008. The bill actually was introduced in December of 2007. So clearly this is something, and at the time in second reading it was clear all three parties of the House were in favour of taking action on this and recognized the need for improvements and standards and changes to the way that this very important category of work is managed and regulated. And we've heard that there are thousands of people who are employed in this sector. And Mr. Speaker, the concern I had in 2007 and continue to have is that we have so many people that are able to don a uniform, go out and take a job where the public expects that they are going to be protected and where the individual, should be concerned for their own safety, and that person has not got the training or the preparation really needed to do their job properly. And it is left very much up to the employers. We should say the employers have, many times offered their own in-house training or have offered training through other programs, but they're not mandatory, Mr. Speaker. And what we wanted to see was that everybody employed in that field would have a minimum level of training to protect themselves on the job, and so that the public could have confidence and know that they are protected as well when they're at a public event or at a place where there are large crowds, or as was mentioned, if you're in an establishment where there's a lot of people and there's drinking, you want to know that there's safety for both the patrons and for the people working. And what had led me to bring this forward in the first instance was an issue of a dance that was held at the Halifax Forum in the summertime several years ago, where it got out of hand and a number, in fact, I think 2 or 3 of the security guards were stabbed, and they were hospitalized. Thank goodness nobody died, but it was really by the grace of God that nobody died, because when you're having fights like that, it can be life and death. And it just pointed out to me that these young men that had been hurt were actually university students who were just making a little extra money and had taken this job to make some money for their school. So you realize that they really had no preparation to step in there. And I, as a parent, I worried about that. I thought this isn't right, that we should have at least the knowledge that they've gone through a minimum training. And so that was my intent in the initial go-round of bringing in Bill 88 a number of years ago. Now, I'm just very pleased that, we've come full circle and now the government has brought their own bill in. I can lament the fact that Bill 88 didn't pass a few years ago, especially where it had all party support, but it was held up here in the legislature and the House closed, as it is apt to do on short notice, and it didn't finish its way through the process. So we have a lot more to look at in Bill 22, Mr. Speaker, and we again are addressing the issue of safety for the public, as well as occupational health and safety for the people that are donning those uniforms and playing that role as either a security guard or bouncer, bodyguard, investigators. And I know that they've captured a lot of different categories in this bill. And Mr. Speaker, one of the concerns I have is, again, that a lot will come out in regulation with this bill. There's a lot more that needs to be spelled out in terms of the standards of training, what exactly is going to be required, how long it's going to take, and so on. And I'm anxious to see that and to know that people in the industry are going to be involved as that evolves. And I wanted to just make the point, and I'll certainly be listening at law amendments to see if this is raised again, but the fact is the Department of Justice staff have talked on a number of occasions about a made in Nova Scotia solution, and that we're going to develop our sort of plan and our standards on our own for Nova Scotia. And I remind the members of the House and Mr. Speaker, yourself as well, that we're a very small province, and a number of other provinces have already enacted legislation, so they would provide models for what to do. And we also have Canadian standards that are in place, and I wanted to refer to those because right now, today, if a security company is going to provide any security services in a federal building, they need to be federally certified. And there's a complete standard in place. It's by the Government of Canada. It has a standards number, and it basically provides a standard and complete training and certification program. And it requires recertification. It lays everything out to keep that license current. And certainly our commissionaires, the Corps of Commissionaires, would be meeting that standard, because they do the security on I think virtually all of the federal buildings, if I'm not mistaken, port security and in other places. So knowing that we have a standard in place already that would meet the needs of probably 85% of the employment categories that are captured in this bill, it would certainly meet the needs, I think, of security guards, the private guards, the in-house security, and the commissionaires. That group together represents 85% of the groups that are being talked about in this bill. There's a few other smaller ones that are in this as well that wouldn't be as much affected. But I think that, you know, my urging here would be that the government look at what's in place federally, because they have an exhaustive, extensive program in place. And it's something that we could pick up and begin to introduce here, you know, whether it's in-house with companies or through another training mechanism. But it's available now, and I don't think we should delay the implementation of this act, you know, while we wait to develop standards that are different from that here in our own province. I just think that what to me is a shame is that we've already wasted 3 years. This should have been done earlier, and the government's been looking at it for some time. So, Mr. Speaker, I just feel that as they go forward to write the regulations that will allow this to become active and to put it into play, we have to consider what is what's going to meet the needs that we have, provide us with that security for the public and safety for the workers, and do it in as efficient a way as possible. And so I'm really asking today that they look at those standards, those Canadian government standards, in order to see if that doesn't meet the needs for a core curriculum and how we move forward. And again, if we're going to try and develop it in-house and then manage it, because remember, when you put a training program in place, you have to be able to come back periodically and ensure that the standards are being met and that the people that have been trained are still meeting what we set out in our licensing, that they're actually getting the right training and have successfully learned the skills they need to know. And that means a lot of follow-up as well. So it isn't just the enormous amount of time it will take Department of Justice staff to develop them. It means setting up a regime where you've got an ongoing quality control and follow-up, really enforcement of those standards. And so I think that we should, you know, because there's an existing system in place with those people that will come and monitor your success and whether or not you're meeting the standards, I think we should seriously look at adopting that as we go forward. I think that's the way to do it. And I wouldn't want to see, and I think my main concern is I don't want to see a tremendous delay while this bill, you know, perhaps passes here and then goes off to the bureaucracy to have the regulations developed. And as we've seen in other bills, that can sometimes take years. And I believe that the safety of the public and the safety of the workers is paramount here, and that the sooner we can take action to put a standard in place and start moving on that, the better, Mr. Speaker. I just feel it's very important. And in the enacting of these regulations, I know the minister has spoken to industry members and the companies and the owners of those companies that are active in Nova Scotia, but I think it's very important that that dialogue continue and that there be an open, you know, sort of consultative process as the regulations are developed, because these are our companies and employers who understand very much how it's going to impact them as they introduce these new standards into their business model. And it's important that we understand whether it's doable, whether they can achieve what's being suggested. And I know the training can be achieved, Mr. Speaker. I'm talking about some of the other things that are built in around it that have to do with the employment standards for the employer. And there are some concerns that there is some significant cost for an employer in this model. And I just want to make sure that they feel they've been listened to and that they have the opportunity to participate in that. And I know it's not the normal process of the House or really of government to involve others in developing regulations, but I think that in order to remain true to that spirit of cooperation, there should be at least a reasonable amount of consultation and dialogue as we go forward. And Mr. Speaker, I know that we'll have an opportunity to speak again at third reading as we go through with more detail on the bill, but with those few comments, I simply wanted to let the government know some of my concerns. I'm extremely supportive of the idea of training. I certainly want to let you know that. I think that this is an essential piece of legislation that we needed to have in place. And nobody I have spoken to, Mr. Speaker, in the industry themselves has ever suggested that we don't need the training. I think that the players, both the employees and the employers, have said that they are supportive of this because they know that it professionalizes a group of employees and gives them skills that are going to be good for the province and good for them individually. And I think that that's well accepted. And I don't want to suggest that anybody has ever said they don't need it. I think they realize we need to improve this industry to make it all that it can be. And so I know that we'll hear from more people at law amendments. I look forward to that debate then and to seeing this return on third reading. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The honourable member from Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise and speak to this bill. I think, first of all, for the record, let me say that I support the principle of the bill, and as both the previous members for the official opposition have stated, the member for Halifax Clayton Park introduced a bill that probably would have been a much more appropriate bill to introduce at this time because it would have addressed the immediate need while allowing the government to continue on and look at the other needs. The member for Cumberland South had asked the question about consultation and what changes. Now, it was interesting to attend the press briefing of the Minister of Justice where he was asked that very question by the media, and they said, they asked him what changes had occurred to this bill as a result of the consultation, and he said none. And Mr. Speaker, at the end of my remarks, I'm going to table over 100 pages of letters the minister and other documents the minister has received from organizations expressing concern about the bill in its current form. And I know a number of these groups, including a representative of the commissioners on behalf of 1,700 commissioners, are planning to appear at law amendments to ask for a delay in this bill, not opposing the bill. Very clearly, I want to state they are not opposing the bill, but asking that it be delayed until the regulations are posted. I'll table them at the end. And Mr. Speaker, I think this is reasonable because I've listened to the minister's comments in the press briefing as well as in the House, and he's indicated that he does not anticipate this bill coming into force for at least a year. Well, Mr. Speaker, yet the Corps of Commissioners and the universities associations who have both expressed concern about this bill in its current form, and concern primarily around what the regulations might say in fairness, have both received a letter in the last week stating that the draft regulations would be available within 3 or 4 days following the passage of this bill. Now, if the draft regulations are going to be available within 3 or 4 days after the passing of this bill, that says to me they must be available now. And there's no reason why the minister shouldn't table those draft regulations so that we can see what we're getting into, because this bill hinges almost exclusively on the regulations. We have no information in the bill as it's written on the use of force model. We have no information on how it impacts some of the large employers that the member for Richmond had referred to. And it strikes me that, you know, this is going to move on to law amendments perhaps as early as tomorrow, I guess. And a number of the organizations that may be on the list may or may not be able to suddenly arrive by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning and be there. And yet they have expressed these concerns in letter after letter, not only to this Justice Minister, but to the member for Cape Breton North when he was the minister, and I'll table those letters as well. And the concern is around knowing exactly what the impact will be. I believe that I am being told the truth by members in the industry when they say to me that they support the bill. I honestly believe that they are telling me the truth, that they support the principle, and that what their concern is the regulations, because it's difficult for them to speak to it without knowing what those are. They also express concern that the Provincial Department of Justice in 2007 put out a discussion paper entitled Regulating Private Security in Nova Scotia as a preamble to this bill, and perhaps in response as well to the member for Clayton Park's bill. Then they had, the results were released in April 2007, and yet many of the key things that the industry had recommended to strengthen this bill are not actually included in this act. And they have yet to actually receive an answer from the department as to why. The other thing we do not have an answer for, and the Minister of Finance is here today, and he's spoken quite eloquently about the need to, contain cost. We all know that. We need to contain costs. And the Minister of Finance, or the Minister of Justice, excuse me, at the press conference was unable to put a price tag on what this bill is going to cost because as it's currently written, it envisions setting up a new administrative structure within the Department of Justice to actually administer the licensing of this bill. And most of the people who have made guesses have made fairly high guesses as to what the annual cost of this is. And I would think that at a time when we are concerned about the finances of the province, we would not entertain passing a bill that the Minister of Justice says he isn't even ready to enact for over a year from now, which means at least one more session of the legislature, and which we don't have the firm costs on, and where there is concern about what the regulations are. Mr. Speaker, I have some reasonable level of certainty that the bill, if it was tabled with the regulations and we knew what we were getting into, might even receive unanimous consent of the House at the end of the day, knowing that everybody knows what's going to happen. But I know that members of this party have been burned before by supporting a bill that then turned around and the regulations actually changed what everybody understood the intent was. And over and over, not by you guys, but over and over, you know, there's we have now heard, and I know that some of these people intend to appear, or at least have registered for law amendments, but the commissioners in Nova Scotia representing 1,700 people, all the university security agencies have now got together and raised the same concern. The volunteer firefighters associations have now come forward and expressed concern about what the regulations might say. And that has to concern every member of this House. And so, Mr. Speaker, while I can accept this going forward to law amendments at this time, I really must ask, I really must ask that the Minister of Justice, since his own department has now sent out a letter saying the regulations will be available within 3 or 4 days of this bill passing, that he table those draft regulations now, today, this week, so that we all know what it is we're talking about, what it is that we're talking about when it comes to the use of force model, what it is that we're talking about when it comes to how it impacts the security agencies that the member from Richmond were talking about, and exactly what the training regime will be to ensure that the intent of the member for Halifax-Clayton Park's original bill is actually carried through in this bill, because at this point we don't even have enough in the bill to know that that intent will be carried forward. Mr. Speaker, with that, I will retire my remarks at this point. I will table this over 100 pages of documentation, including letters back and forth between the Minister's office and the previous Minister's office and industry officials, just asking that this clarity be provided. And I hope that this will be addressed, and I hope that it will be passed on to the Minister of Justice that we would ask that he table the draft regulations this week before it comes for final reading. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of my colleague, the Minister of Justice, I would like to thank all members for their interventions. As always, we are open to constructive suggestions for change, whether they're coming from the opposition at this stage or at the next stage or through the law amendments process. And all remarks made in this House will, of course, be carefully considered, since we all want the bill to be as good as it can possibly be. On behalf of my colleague, the Minister of Justice, I would now move second reading of this bill.
Thank you. The motion is for second reading on Bill number 22, Security and Investigative Services Act. Is the House ready for the question? Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Against? Motion carried.
Bill 22, entitled An Act Respecting the Provision of Security Services and Investigative Services.
Order that this bill be referred to Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could you please call Bill number 35, the Finance Act?
Bill number 35, the Finances Act. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm here today to move for second reading Bill number 35, which will repeal the Provincial Finance Act and introduce a new Finance Act. The Provincial Finance Act came into existence in 1942. Some of its provisions appear to go as far back as 1923. Since 1942, the last substantial revision to the Act was in 1962, and since then there have been piecemeal amendments made over many years through many, many different bills. Mr. Speaker, this is the first time in over 40 years that the Act as a whole has been rewritten in its entirety. And while I admit it may not be a particularly exciting topic for many people, it is an important one for the financial administration of the government of this province. If passed, this new Finance Act will take effect on August the 1st of this year. The move to repeal the current Provincial Finance Act and replace it with a new Finance Act was driven by a need to modernize the language, bring clarity, and improve control to certain sections of the current Act. And Mr. Speaker, I would like to mention that among other things, of course, we are changing the title. I thought it somewhat amusing when I looked at the statutes of the province that the Provincial Finance Act was right between the Provincial Dog Act and the Provincial Fish Act, just ahead of the Provincial Fossil Act. And it seemed to me that among other things, we should just put it under F for finance where it belonged. It is itself a bit of a fossil, as I've just said. This new Finance Act, as I said, brings the Act up to date and uses modern language to govern the financial administration of the entire government. The new Finance Act, among other things, clearly addresses spending authority, clearly a fundamental role of this House, for that, Mr. Speaker, and for the executive branch. This Act outlines 5 key sources of spending authority when each source of authority is required, removing any existing ambiguity. The 5 main sources of spending authority are, first, an appropriation; second, an additional appropriation; third, 50% of the previous year's appropriation if there is no budget, as happened in the last fiscal year; fourth, a special warrant; or finally, fifth, a final additional appropriation for year-end adjustments. In addition, since the last major revision of the Provincial Finance Act, the province has adopted generally accepted accounting principles for the public sector, referred to in the jargon of the Department of Finance, which is replete with acronyms, Mr. Speaker, as PS-GAAP, PSGAAP. The language of the new Finance Act has been updated to be consistent with those principles which now govern the financial administration of the province. And while sometimes subtle, these wording changes are significant in financial management because they reflect the province's use of accrual accounting rather than cash accounting. Regarding financial transactions, the Finance Act now provides, or will provide if adopted, clear instructions to government entities on the requirements to get approval from Governor and Council or Treasury Board before committing government to future debt or operating funding obligations. Another new addition to the Finance Act is the annual borrowing plan. It improves Governor and Council's control and oversight over borrowings and reflects the true workings of the capital markets. The new Finance Act requires an annual borrowing plan to be approved by Governor and Council before any borrowings are completed. Then, as Minister of Finance, I would have the responsibility to execute the borrowing plan as determined appropriate throughout the year. And now, Mr. Speaker, one of the oddities that struck me after I became the Minister of Finance is that under the existing practice, the province would borrow money, sometimes in the hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars, and then seek cabinet approval. Needless to say, the first time I saw this process in action, I said to Department of Finance Act, that makes no sense. Why do we do it that way? And the answer was a variation on, well, that's the way that we've always done it. And I asked the question also, well, what would happen if Cabinet said no? And the answer was essentially, well, no one would ever loan money to the province again. So it only makes sense, Mr. Speaker, that the Cabinet should approve the borrowing program in advance, and then the Minister of Finance executes it through the very capable staff in our Liability Management Treasury Services branch. Mr. Speaker, we've also in this bill included a definition of the government reporting entity known as the GRE. I have to tell you that this department is just full of acronyms, and some I just refuse to use. But Mr. Speaker, sometimes I just have to say to staff, I'm not ever using that acronym, and I try and take the expressions that they give to me and put it in what I think of as ordinary language. Anyway, the GRE is another one of those, Mr. Speaker. It's defined as representing all entities included in the consolidated financial statements of the province, and this will provide guidance and structure to those looking to create new entities or to understand how a new entity will fit within the government reporting entity. As I said at the outset, Mr. Speaker, this is fairly dry stuff, but fundamentally important to the proper financial administration of the province. Various definitions within the Finance Act have also been changed to make them more clear and understandable and to avoid ambiguity and confusion. For example, Mr. Speaker, the term consolidated fund will be changed to general revenue fund. This will provide clarity as the term consolidated fund is often confused with the consolidated financial statements of the province, which are an entirely different thing, but both use the word consolidated. The definition of department has also been changed to refer to those entities created under the Public Service Act. The definition in the current Act extends to entities that are potentially not controlled by the province, and obviously that's something that we need to avoid. And finally, Mr. Speaker, another example of the changes that this rewrite would enact if adopted by this House is that sale of Crown assets has been changed to sale of real property of the government reporting entity. Real property is a well-understood legal term, and the requirement of net monetary proceeds being returned to the General Revenue Fund is considered by us to be appropriate control over public money. Mr. Speaker, I do understand that these measures and this rewriting of the Provincial Finance Act may seem technical. However, they are essential for a modern and relevant Finance Act and essential for the proper financial administration of the government of the province. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The honourable member from Kings West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I just really want to say a few words about the Finance Act. I think the process of modernizing the Provincial Finance Act was long overdue, as the minister, when he took on this portfolio, discovered that there were some practices and processes that did need updating. So having the Act go through an overhaul that would make it more responsive and more in tune with the language of today, because finally it is consistent with GAP, and that probably is one of the strongest aspects of the changes that are in this Act. I think the only real, I guess, area I wanted to point out, and my colleague as well, who is a former critic, will also make a few comments today as well. But I think the annual borrowing plan approved by Governor and Council, and then the Finance Minister then executing the plan at his discretion, is in fact the right order for this process to be executed, because we're talking about very, very large sums of money, and I think it would indeed be a misfortune for the province if something were to go astray in that process. So while it has you know, a very strong technical component to it, I think it delivers actually a much smoother and much more understandable way of initiating financial transactions in the province. So we'll be pleased to support the Finance Act.
Thank you. The honourable member from Argyle.
Thank you very much.
The honourable member.
There we go. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm glad to stand in a few moments today to make a couple comments on the Finance Act on behalf of our finance critic, the member for Inverness. An act that's been around as long as this one, of course, it is time for its renewal. It's time for its modernization. Government has changed dramatically since 1923, when the original parts of this act were brought into place. We've gone to to very small borrowing programs to extremely large borrowing programs. We've gone from shaky kind of accounting to generally accepted accounting principles, ones that we were very happy to bring forward in our term as government, and one that we're very happy to see enshrined in the Finance Act. If I am to question some of the pieces that are in here, really falls upon what the honourable member for Kings West just spoke to. When it comes to the authorization of borrowing plans, Mr. Speaker, we borrow, millions, if not billions of dollars every year on an annual basis, because a lot of the bonds and pieces come due, and we have to go out and borrow them again because, of course, our debt is such that it'll be a while before we start paying that down again. Now, Mr. Speaker, the challenge that I see, and maybe it's maybe it's for the minister to explain further. A lot of times, the borrowing division within the Department of Finance really has to be reactive to markets, and in some cases, there's a good rate to be had on one day, and that rate might not be available on the next day, for instance. So I would question, the speed in which that division of the Department of Finance is going to be able to react to good bargains or deals when it comes to the interest rates that it will be paying on behalf of Nova Scotians. When that division will have to prepare report and recommendation to Cabinet, and we all know that takes some time. I think ministers are finding out that, as much as we can bring an idea forward to Cabinet and talk about it, by the time the paperwork's done, a lot of time goes by. And I know I see the Minister of Fisheries shaking his head a little bit, and his example really would be around bringing forward the loans issues from Loan Board, for example. A lot of times it takes time for those things to come forward. So Mr. Speaker, even though we accept the updating of this Act, the modernization of this Act, I wonder a little bit about the speed in which we'll be able to borrow within the department, making sure that we have, of course, the best type of deal available to Nova Scotians when it comes to borrowing those dollars. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I again thank the Minister for bringing this forward, and of course looking forward to it moving on in the legislative process.
Thank you. The honourable member from Halifax, Clayton Park.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm pleased to be able to rise, as was said, I'm the former finance critic for the Liberal Party, so I'm pleased to rise and say a few words on the Finance Act. I couldn't let that pass. It's called an Act Respecting Provincial Financial Administration, and I do think it's a good thing. I don't know if this was something in the works when the current finance minister arrived or if he initiated it, but it certainly was something that needed to be updated. Usually we hear if it was something that was already in the works, but anyway, I did want to say that it's the right thing to do to update the language and to certainly bring our Finance Act into line with the modern accounting trends and just the differences, even in making the terminology a little bit more accessible. As you say, going from something like the Consolidated Fund, which is a little bit obscure to most people, to calling it the General Revenue Fund, that makes a lot more sense. And so modernizing the language and hopefully making it a little bit more accessible to people to understand is an important thing. I'm not sure that I'm the only accountant in the House, but I do have an accounting designation, so I think I'm one of the few in this House of Assembly. And with that in mind, I certainly understand the gap principles and how we've moved public sector accounting from a cash basis of reporting to looking at the same principles that are in place, by and large, as we have in business reporting, and looking at obligations so that in the past, if it wasn't cash in or cash out in a given year, it wasn't reported. Now now we have to report what the overall long-term obligations are and recognize them in the year that they're used, and there's a lot of other things in place. If we have outstanding obligations for the next year, that would appear on this year's books if we in fact incurred it this year. So those are the kind of things that GAP takes into account. They take into account things where you've made an obligation this year but you haven't paid it yet, but you have to recognize it against this year's revenue. So it's certainly an important thing to do, and I wanted to just commend the staff in the Department of Finance, because I know that the work they do is tremendously complex. The minister mentioned a little bit about the vast sums of money that are being borrowed in order to finance our ongoing operations and then repaid on a regular basis. We have lots of bonds that are coming due and maturing at all times through the year, and so it becomes a very technical and very sophisticated world that they're working in financially. And I think that we are very fortunate to have very qualified and very professional people working in that area, because I know that each of us as Nova Scotians rely on their good judgment and on their care and the work they do, and certainly the Minister of Finance relies on them, I'm sure, to a large degree, because none of us can understand fully what they are managing, and we need to rely on their skill and expertise. So it is very important to be doing that. Whenever we talk about the spending authorities, and the minister went through what's outlined in Bill 35, and that is the 5 spending authorities, and I quickly jotted them down because I wasn't sure I could name all 5. I now can, because he's helped me out there. But as soon as we hear additional appropriations, really our antenna go up as members of the House. And the Minister of Finance himself was probably the most vocal critic, I shall say, of significant additional appropriations and money going through, particularly money that was approved and spending approved through order in council. And that's really what I'm referring to when Cabinet makes an arbitrary decision to large spending commitments outside of the House of Assembly. So we have our regular appropriations, which are well known, but then we have the other things like special warrants that Cabinet can do, or final appropriations that can be done, and they don't come back here to the legislature. We see the original budget and we approve the original budget, but there are a lot of decisions made through the year, and we saw over the years quite an increase in the use of that tool under the former government, the government that has just this year no longer in power, but for the 10 years previous had been. There was a real increase in the use of these powers of Cabinet. And I'm hoping, I haven't had a chance to look at the clause by clause, and I don't imagine that there's anything in here that would limit the power of Cabinet or set limits on that use. But because it is outlined here in the Act what the powers are and under which means government can spend money, I think it might be something of use to consider that there be limits or some safeguards put in place to prevent it being overused or even abused as a means to fund a lot of other, I'll call them pet projects that come up through the year that never came back to the legislature to be looked at. And I know there have been different private members' bills introduced here suggesting that those expenditures should come back to the legislature or should be presented to the members of the House so that they get a further approval, because ultimately as a body, as all the members together representing the legislature, we're responsible for the spending of the province. And I think it's really the wrong tack to take to allow the government, and particularly the Cabinet, to sit and make those decisions without any consultation or any sober second thought, shall we say, from the rest of the House. So, I would like to raise that because I think it was something that was of concern to the Minister of Finance when he was previously the finance critic for the official opposition. And I've told him in the past, I always listened carefully when he spoke as a critic. I thought he often had some very good ideas. On the sale of real property, I understand he mentioned the renaming of that it used to be called the sale of Crown assets. Now it's going to be called the sale of real property. I have just one aspect or point that I'd like to raise in looking at that, and that is that particularly in the sale of property, there is, again, this is a decision decision made and taken at the cabinet table when real property is being sold, and it doesn't come back to the public at any point to know that that's happening. And I will just refer to the Blue Mountain Birch Cove Lakes. We were very concerned about more of that property being sold prior to its now being named a wilderness protected area. Mr. Speaker, it now has the protection that it cannot be sold or whittled down in any way. But over the years, that large piece of land, which is by Bears Lake and close to Clayton Park and Hammonds Plains and Timberley area, it had over the years had big chunks of it sold off to private owners. And we were very fortunate that by the time we made it a wilderness area, there was still 4,000 acres there and 3,300 had been protected. But we actually had members of the public and people involved in some of the conservation organizations watching every time there was a new list of Order in Council announcements that would come out. And I don't know how quickly they appear online, but after a bit of a delay, decisions that were made at Cabinet do appear with an Order in Council number. And you'd get a one-liner about what that Order in Council was. And people were really on the high alert about would there have been a sale of property in that area, because we didn't want to see it diminished in any way. And as I say, over time we had seen even tiny slivers of property sold, which gave access to some of the private landowners where they could get in, perhaps they could log or get in closer to land that they owned. And we had been very concerned even about small parcels changing hands, because that could make a difference on what happened and what sort of use was made of the land that was up there. So what I would like to see is that when there are sales of property, that there is, prior to an Order in Council, that there would be some means to notify the community or even confer with the community that there was going to be a sale of Crown lands. Because no matter really whether it's big or small, I think the public have a right to know in advance, because as you know, wherever we live in the province, where we know there's public land, we use it, whether it's to walk your dog or to enjoy nature, to go for hikes. People see it as a public asset. And right now, there's no way to ensure that that asset isn't sold out from under you by an Order in Council. You know, there could have been an offer made that we're completely unaware of in the community, and the government entertains that offer and a sale is made. And I know that from the anxiety that we felt in my community around looking at the Crown land in this particular case of the Blue Mountain Birch Cove Lakes, that was a great concern to us, that Cabinet had the authority just at a stroke of a pen to sell public land in your area without even explaining why. Like, what is the benefit, or what we're doing it for, or what we're trading it for that might be a better benefit. Previously, actually, under the Conservative government, there had been a plan. I don't think it ever got very developed, but it was when the government wanted to bring Cape Split into public ownership. And I think I'm not sure who owned it, maybe Minus Pulp and Paper owned Cape Split, which, as we know, is a park area. It's a wonderful landmark in the valley, and actually a landmark from the Parsborough shore as well when you look across across the Minas Basin. But that was a laudable thing, that they wanted to bring Cape Split into public hands, but they had to find money or other land to trade to do it. And we know that there had been discussions underway to trade a large amount of land in the Blue Mountain Birch Cove Lakes area to Minas Basin, because they also have a property development arm, and that would have been attractive land for them to develop as for housing or for some sort of commercial use. And we know that behind closed doors that was entertained and being thought of by the previous Conservative government. Never came to the public, sort of any public forum. It was more just almost rumor and innuendo that this was going on, and it was a possible threat. And we were very relieved when that didn't happen and the government found the funds to actually buy Cape Split outright. But we know that in the land of land development and development in general, there's a lot of swapping of land. And a lot of times people that are in the land development area will approach government with suggestions, or even if they're in the resource area and they want land for logging or for mining purposes. There's a lot of swapping that goes on, and a lot of propositions made to government. And I would like to see this government, and I don't know if they can do it in this act. I would somewhat doubt that they're going to add anything to the act now. But I really felt it was a good opportunity to suggest to the Minister of Finance and to his colleagues that it would be seen in a very, very positive light in the public's eye, in any community, because every community has some public land that is Crown owned. And I think it would be a really positive sign to say, before we dispose or sell trade any public land, we will notify the community. And that means of notification or consultation could be determined by the government. But I think that it's wrong to have members of the public, Nova Scotians, who have a concern about land in their area, to have to comb through orders in council looking to see if it's happened and they've lost public land in their area. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I certainly do look forward to seeing if anybody comes to law amendments on this act and whether or not there will be any more light shed upon it. But I'm glad I had the opportunity to point out a few things that I think could be improving our provincial finances. Thank you.
Thank you. If I recognize the Honourable the Minister of Finance will be to close debate on Bill number 35. The Honourable the Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And once again, I'd like to thank all members for their intervention. Of course, the government is open to constructive changes. We are always open to constructive changes and look forward to any representations from the opposition or indeed from any member of the public who appears at the Law Amendments Committee. With that, Mr. Speaker, I would move second reading of the proposed Finance Act.
Thank you. The motion is for second reading on Bill number 35, the Finance Act. Is the House ready for the question? The question has been called. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Against? Motion carried.
Bill 35, entitled An Act Respecting Provincial Financial Administration.
Order that this bill be referred to Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill number 38, the Voluntary Carbon Emissions Offset Fund Act?
Bill number 38. The Honourable the Minister of the Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move second reading of the Act to establish Nova Scotia's voluntary carbon emission offset funds. Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to moving Nova Scotia to a low-carbon economy. We have shown this commitment by setting new renewable energy targets of 25% by 2015 into law. We have also created a new goal of 40% renewable energy by 2020. Mr. Speaker, we are also the first and the only province to set hard caps on greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector. We made significant investments in energy efficiency and tidal energy, and we have invested in new renewable energy companies. Mr. Speaker, we are taking these steps to improve the environment and to also create new jobs for Nova Scotians in a stronger economy. It is the right thing to do. Now, Mr. Speaker, we are taking another major step forward with the introduction of an act to establish the Nova Scotia Volunteer Carbon Emission Offset Fund. We are giving all Nova Scotians a chance to participate in a low-carbon economy. Mr. Speaker, through this bill, we will encourage Nova Scotians to support Nova Scotia-based projects that reduce air emissions that lead to climate change. This bill outlines how Nova Scotians can offset greenhouse gas emissions from their everyday activities. Nova Scotians will be able to do that by buying carbon credits from ineligible Nova Scotia-based projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Nova Scotians businesses, organizations, and individuals have a lot to contribute to help us meet our climate change targets. Mr. Speaker, this bill will be a tool that allows them to participate. This will further efforts in our province already underway to reduce harmful air emissions. As we all know, individuals and businesses can reduce their carbon footprint by using less energy or using cleaner energy. However, it is very difficult and costly to reduce a carbon footprint to zero by using only tools of energy efficiency, conservation, and renewable energy. Mr. Speaker, an additional way to address this problem is through volunteer carbon offset funds. This bill will allow for the creation of such a fund. These offset funds allow customers to purchase emission credits, a unit of carbon emissions reduction. It is usually measured in metric tons. When you purchase an emission credit, you are actually funding the removal of 1 ton of carbon emissions from the atmosphere. By doing this, you create emission offset. As we all know, individuals or businesses who want to offset their carbon emissions can complete energy efficiency or renewable energy projects that reduce their emissions as much as possible. But, Mr. Speaker, they can take the effort one step farther with carbon offset fund. They can purchase emission credits to apply against their remaining emissions. The carbon offset fund may grant money to projects such as tree planting or perhaps a project to extract gas from a landfill. Here is a more specific example. If a commercial hothouse operator in Nova Scotia wanted to convert the heating of their operation from oil to natural gas or biomass, they could apply to the carbon offset fund. The resulting reduction in emissions from the fuel conversion would translate into carbon credits. The carbon credits go back to the fund where they are sold to investors to help offset their own emissions from their airplane flights or their business conferences or their factory or what have you. Mr. Speaker, the carbon offset fund will reduce emissions in our province and contribute to the economy of our beautiful province. Unlike Air Canada carbon credits, for example, which may be applied to the economy of other jurisdictions, this fund will be by Nova Scotians and for Nova Scotians. The hothouse example is a good one, and there can be many more like it. We will be looking for projects that will achieve real emissions reductions in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, we will be laying out the criteria in more details in months ahead, but generally, we will be looking for projects that demonstrate that emissions can be reduced way beyond the levels that would normally occur in business operations were left unchanged. Through the Climate Change Directory, under the Department of Environment, we will be working out the details and bringing forward regulations. These regulations will cover what types of projects will be able to sell emission credits to the fund. We will certainly look at renewable energy efficiency, and other types of projects that can lead to emissions reductions. If they are, in some way, additional to the normal operations and can be verified, the Volunteer Carbon Offset Trust will purchase emissions credits and offer them for sale. Mr. Speaker, we will establish a purchasing process and work with the project developers to develop a supply of emission credits. We are not alone in this area. Carbon offset funds occur elsewhere in the world. This fund is similar to the one set up in British Columbia, but is unique to Nova Scotia. It is a way for Nova Scotians to invest here at home and to help build a better life for families in all regions of our province. Mr. Speaker, government is also doing its part. Our government will be preparing a strategy for reducing government's own carbon footprint. It will include an additional $5 million of this year's budget being invested in retrofitting government buildings to reduce energy use and emissions. The Eco Nova Scotia Fund of Clean Air and Climate Change has also helped. It contributed $4.1 million toward the Government House in Order program to retrofit government buildings to use less energy. Mr. Speaker, this work is just part of an aggressive approach to reduce emissions throughout the province. We are committed to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions down to 10% below 1990 levels by the year 2020. Climate change is a serious issue, Mr. Speaker. We believe this bill reflects genuine leadership in addressing it. Nova Scotians can use the Volunteer Carbon Offset Fund to join in, take part, and help make our province cleaner, greener, and more prosperous. Mr. Speaker, this fund is all about working together for a healthy environment that is linked with a stronger economy. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And thank you to the Minister for his remarks. I don't disagree with much of what he said. I think that, you know, it's interesting that climate change and environmental issues have, in my view, become the issue, not only locally but worldwide. And when we look at financial impacts and so forth, I honestly believe that, in fact, the environmental issues we're facing in the world will actually direct what happens in terms of our economic future and many other issues. And so, Mr. Speaker, I have no problem with establishing a fund, a voluntary fund. Let me be clear on where people can put money in terms of offsets. Now, the comments I would have, I guess, is in speaking with departmental staff, they did suggest that the Cabinet could have done this without a bill. We'll still support the bill, but they indicated they could have created the fund through the Department of Finance without the need for legislation. So the answer that I still haven't got to yet, and hopefully by the time we hit third reading, I'll have that answer, is why there's a need to have the Act anyways, when in fact on Earth Day, when this bill was tabled, we could have actually started with a fund. The other thing that I would like to see in this is if it's unclear to me what is going to make anybody contribute right off the top. And I know it's a voluntary thing and there's a feel-good element, but what I would like to see is if the province is going to establish a fund, a Made in Nova Scotia fund, then I would like to see a commitment by the province of Nova Scotia to offset their own activities into this fund. If the government isn't willing to offset their own activities, then why is anybody from the private sector going to come forward and put money into a government fund? I just don't believe that's going to happen. And so I would encourage the minister to look at that. I think that, you know, this is another one of those cases where the devil's in the details and the devil's in the regulations, and that's been unfortunate. But I do, I have faith that the minister will ensure that, should there be any monies that appear in this fund, that they are invested in Nova Scotia businesses to create Nova Scotia green jobs. It would be a shame to see, you know, a heavy oil engine manufacturer who decides to put a solar panel on his roof to get funding out of this fund, when in fact the general operation might be contributing more towards carbon excesses than otherwise might be. So I think that the devil's going to be in the details of making sure that the funds that are contributed to projects from this make a lot of sense. Mr. Speaker, I'll certainly support it going to second reading, and I really don't have any, it's a voluntary fund. So as a voluntary fund, I have no problem supporting this bill right to the end, and I'm not sure why he didn't just do it through a cabinet decree and create the fund, but nonetheless, he wants to go by legislation, and that's okay. We'll go with that. But I would encourage the minister to come forward in due course with a plan to explain how the provincial government will be contributing to the fund that it itself is creating. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The honourable member from Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased as well to have just a few minutes today to rise and speak to Bill number 38. It's quite an interesting topic, obviously, with all that's going on with green and more green these days. So it's good to have this bill before us. I guess some of the really only issues that quickly going through it that I have, you know, where their greenhouse gas is now higher than they've ever been, something does have to be done. But again, this is a voluntary option, and I think that we would like to see a little more than that. Mr. Speaker, you know, in the Minister's news release last week, he said businesses, organizations and people will be able to purchase these emission credits from the fund. Saying one carbon credit, of course, will removal or equal the removal of a ton of carbon emissions from the atmosphere. And I'd like to know, with this bill being strictly voluntary, does the Minister have any type of firm commitment from businesses, organizations or people who will actually participate in this plan? And perhaps he does, and we look forward to hearing more as it goes through further readings and certainly through on the other side over at law amendments. And you know, from what I'm seeing, next year is the target, so it's going to be a little while being put into place, but that's fine as well, provided it's given the time that it needs and the right bill goes forward and the right amendments and people come in and offer their input. And again, with the voluntary piece, somewhat of a concern. We'd like to see it strong. We hope that many businesses will. I know that there are businesses now who purchase carbon credits, and I know there's one in my backyard with Minus Basin who are a great supporter and like this program. So, and I think that it's a good program, and again, I'd like to see, you know, I want to be able to see Minus Basin. I'm sure they want to as well, having spoke with them in great detail on some of these issues that they want to be able to purchase. It's a good thing, and they see the credit and the benefit to those credits in the future. So, you know, there's many ways we can go by reducing the greenhouse gases in this province, whether it's through other means of transportation, and I know that that's an issue in this province, Mr. Speaker. We don't have great options for transportation in the rural areas like we have here in the HRM, so it's hard to promote, you know, how we cut greenhouse gas emissions. Perhaps the province should look at some of those types of things, I hope, as well. And I hope we hear from some of those groups as well going ahead that the importance of, you know, cutting greenhouse gas emissions, not only through this type of voluntary bit, but trying to put some things in place that will better serve Nova Scotia as a whole and North America and the world in general itself. So I think that there are a lot of opportunities. I think that there are people that will, and I know that there are people now that are taking an interest in this and will take part in the legislation and in the program that's being offered. And I hope that you know, that there will be a way that we're reaching out, not just waiting for them to come to us, but that the government will reach out to some of these bigger industries in a way to help get them interested, give them the incentives that they require. And again, I'd like to see them working on a few other initiatives, and I'll speak to that more as we go forward, probably in law amendments and through third reading. There'll be another opportunity. And I got lots of notes and lots of things I could talk to. I'm not going to take a lot of time today to do it. I just wanted to make those few brief comments and state that I think that, you know, the bill has great potential in this act. And again, I'd really like to see it tough enough that we're making, and I hate to use the word, I don't want to use dictate, I don't want to use the word make it too strong, but we need to have something that says to companies, this is a good thing. This is a great thing to be part of and to take part in, and to individuals as well, because as the minister, as I quoted a few minutes ago, his statement basically said, carbon credit value is a ton of emissions, and if we can reduce that as individuals, every little bit helps. So perhaps some of us who are very keen in the world of recycling will be able to get involved in this, and we'll be able to take some kind of advantage, because there are a lot of people, individuals, who are actually very, very keen in recycling and reducing greenhouse gas emissions and however those things are created. And they'll have a keen interest in this, this piece because it's an environmental piece. And there's a lot of everyday Nova Scotians who are very interested in our current situation and certainly where we're going to be in just a few short years when it comes to issues surrounding the environment. And they're looking for things to be improved. We talk a lot about being leaders in this province. And I hope that what comes of this piece of legislation will indeed continue on the leadership that we've had in previous years. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll thank you very much for the opportunity to speak on Bill 38 this afternoon and take my seat.
Thank you. If I recognize the Honourable the Minister, will be the closed debate on Bill number 38. The Honourable the Minister of the Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And first of all, I want to thank the members opposite for their kind comments regarding this particular bill. I want to move second reading and close debate on the Volunteer Carbon Emission Offset Fund, Bill 38. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The motion is for second reading on Bill number 38. It's the House ready for the question. Question has been called. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Against? Motion carried.
Bill 38, entitled an act to establish the Nova Scotia Voluntary Carbon Emissions Offset Fund.
Order that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill number 47, the Education Act?
Bill number 47, the Education Act. The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to stand today in support of Bill 47, an amendment to the Education Act, which will further improve and clarify the school review process. Everyone, I think, will agree that the decision to review a school for possible closure is always a difficult one, not only for school boards, but for parents, students, and staff served by or working in that school. That is why it's important that we make the decision-making process as clear, as open, and as accountable to the public as we can. These proposed amendments, Mr. Speaker, will clarify the process and also serve to increase the opportunity for community engagement and public input. As many of you know, the House passed school review legislation in 2008 that increased community input into the process and expanded the time frame to 1 year. With 2 years of experience and school reviews undertaken by 2 boards since the legislation was passed, we discovered that there is still some room for improvement. In developing these new amendments, we sought advice from boards and school advisory councils involved in those school reviews that occurred in 2008-09 and 2009-10. We conducted 2 consultations last fall. Those focus group sessions identified some areas of concern and offered a number of helpful recommendations to improve the process. It was evident from those discussions that there is a need to clarify for boards exactly what circumstances should require the school review process and what exemptions should apply. Specifically, boards still question whether a review is required in situations where 2 or more neighbourhood schools are to be replaced by 1 new school. The amendments we have before us today clarify that any school which is identified by a school board for possible closure be reviewed. This will ensure that all school communities whose school is under review will be involved and engaged in determining the fate of their school. The only exception will be situations where 1 school is closed and replaced with a new school, with essentially no change in the student population. This legislation will also allow us to make, through regulation, a number of other improvements, including 1 additional public meeting at the study committee stage of the process, and more time for board staff and the study committee members to do their work. The total time allowed for a review will remain at 1 year, but there will be new deadlines within the 1-year time frame, which will allow staff and committee to complete the work they need to do away from the summer months. Mr. Speaker, my staff will also be developing regulations that will require boards to identify their sources of data and the methodologies they use for their enrollment projections when preparing their identification and impact assessment reports. That way, the public will have a much greater confidence in the material being put forward to support the identification of a school for possible closure. We will also be requiring that public notice of school board decisions be made available on the board website. By making the school review process clearer and providing more input at crucial stages of the process will mean better, more informed decision-making. Thank you, and I look forward to what my colleagues have to say.
Thank you. The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased today to rise in my place to speak to Bill number 47, an act to amend Chapter 1 of the Acts of 1995-96, the Education Act. The other day when the minister held a bill briefing across the street, she mentioned something that, quite frankly, sort of set off alarm bells in my ear when she talked about the data for closing schools. And we've just seen a report that was thrown out because the department did not this particular department, but the department in question did not like the data collection. So I guess I'm a little concerned when I hear that they're going to be having schools live up to certain sources of data, and my concern, I guess, is that those sources, are they going to be politically motivated? If in fact it is sort of clear cut and these are I guess what really bothers me about this bill is that we talk about regulations. In fact, regulations is mentioned 5 times in this single page, but we have no idea what those regulations are. Those regulations could be anything, and maybe that's normal to have regulations tabled afterwards, but it seems to me that when we're talking legislation, the devil is in the details. And how can I know that what you're going to propose as a regulation is in fact adequate? We don't know that. We just have to sort of take it on faith. So I have some objection that when we're voting on bills here, we don't see the regulations. And in fact, if the minister wants to table those regulations before we actually vote on it, I think that would be great, because that would let us know what we're actually voting on. Because it seems to me a lot of times when there are problems with bills, it's because the regulations that came in were not what members thought they were going to be. The other thing that concerns me is that the explanatory note that is added here gives the minister authority to make regulations with respect to exceptions to the school review process. And to me, that authority already exists. And so I ask myself, why are we saying it clearly? Why are we setting that out in legislation? And it's almost as if the minister is trying to head off potential lawsuits or something like that, because they are in fact preparing to close a school or schools. And so I have to ask myself, why change that? Why do that? Is it to protect the minister from lawsuits? And then I ask myself, geez, what schools are they preparing to close? And that is my concern, because, and maybe I'm just being suspicious, but it does lead one to wonder, why make this change at this time? So, while I think that the idea of the bill is a good idea, to have sort of a standard of regulations that are set out, I do note that most boards do have processes that are well defined, and in fact a couple of boards have been looking at beefing up those processes. I just sort of wonder why we're making these changes now. I'd like to see the regulations, and I have concerns around the minister's wish to enshrine in law her ability to make exceptions to the school review process. Thank you.
Thank you. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, and I'm pleased to stand today and speak on behalf of or speak about the Bill 47, and to indicate that I have spoken to the minister. I did attend the briefing, and I have indicated to her that I would support anything that would strengthen the Education Act, and I make that statement publicly. I do know that we have, based on the changes that were made in 2008, a very clearly defined process, and I think that was it was deemed that that was necessary at that time because boards needed direction and communities needed, I guess, a sense of satisfaction that there was a process that all boards would have to follow, and all communities welcomed that. That process was put in place to allow the very thing that the minister speaks about here, and that is to make sure that community consultation, community input, and community involvement were part of the process. The other components that were put in place at that time were that the timeline was clearly defined, so communities knew when the process would start, and they knew where along that process there would be opportunities for input, public meeting, consultation, and sharing of report. And back in 2008, when that was adopted, I believe it did provide some sense of satisfaction and relief in communities that there would not be a decision that would be made prematurely or without consultation. The other thing that was included at that time was the collection of data. And I know that the minister has spoken to that, and I'm not sure if that is the result of perhaps boards not being clear on the data that they were using. One board would be using one, another, and communities maybe were questioning that, and I'm not sure about that, but I would expect that the sources of the data would very much be an important part of the process, and again, to build that confidence in communities that that it was a clean process and it was based on not only their input but on the information that was available. And so that whole consistency in process was something that was welcomed by communities. And I believe since that time, the minister has said that 2 boards have gone through that process. And I know I had some conversation with some folks whose school was under review. And they asked me the question, can the board do this? And my response was, in fact, I copied for them the school closure process, so they as a community would know exactly. And when we talked about it, the school board was going through the process, but they were reassured to know that there was a process and the board was following it. So I think those are 2 important things. I did question at the time of the briefing, and I will raise it again, is the need to have it put into legislation. Because as I read through the powers of the minister and the regulations of the minister, it appears to me that the authority currently exists for the minister to be very much a part of the process and the outcome of the process, and that if a change needed to be put in place, that it could have been put in through regulation based on what is written about the regulations of the minister and the powers of the minister. So my only question is why, and I look forward to hopefully that question being asked, and if in fact there is something that we don't know about the rationale for this, then I would certainly ask the minister to share that. But again, I would go back and say that anything that will strengthen the process, anything that will give communities reassurance that the process is clear, they understand it, and that it's followed. We know that communities are always anxious. And we know that as soon as somebody starts checking the enrollment in a school, that the community gets in a panic, and they believe that that means an automatic closure. So I think the process that we put in place and is now supported by this minister reassures them that that will not happen without their involvement and without their participation. So I look forward to this going forward. I would never stand in the way of any legislation that strengthens the Act or improves the process, but I will look forward to answers to the question. Thank you.
Thank you. If I recognize the minister, will be to close debate on bill number 47. The Honourable, the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable members for their thoughtful comments. I do want to give credit to the former government. I think the process and the recommendations that resulted in the provincial school review policy that happened over, I think, 2007, 2008 were excellent. And they make up probably 99.9% of the provincial school policy. What we're proposing here is just a minor clarification. And I do remember that they actually had 2 co-chairs of the committee that went around the province and did the consultation with parents and educators and school boards and students. And I remember attending the consultation meeting for the metro area, which was actually held at Dartmouth High School. And it was a very healthy debate about what criteria perhaps should trigger school reviews. It also included the consideration of some community factors, whereas usually boards are just looking at educational factors. And I remember giving credit to the government at the time for both the process and the outcome of that. So what we're talking about here is really very, very minor, but the reason we want to include it in the Act, in legislation, is because there was some question about interpretation of the original, one small piece of the original Act, Education Act, as amended to reflect the new provincial school review policy. And that was over what happens if you close 2 schools and replace them with 1. And boards were interpreting that as meaning you didn't have to do school review. And because one of the critical principles and values of the original policy was to broaden the opportunity for communities and parents to have input and be engaged in that decision-making process, it was felt that that small clarification was important enough to amend the Act so that everyone going into the process in the future would clearly understand that this had to apply in those situations. Regulations usually happen after an act is passed through this legislature, and you know that they're going to be very minor, but they'll be available for review, or no, you know, we'll certainly make them available to the critics when that happens, when they're passed by order in council. But they haven't been determined. They will be in response to the suggestions and recommendations that came from these 2 focus groups. So there's not going to be anything new that I as minister or our government or the department is adding. Any of the changes under this amendment and the regulations evolved out of the suggestions of the 2 focus groups, and they were composed of people who had had experience through the full cycle of the relatively new provincial review policy. So we were listening to boards, we were listening to the school advisory councils, and that is the only reason that we've moved forward on this clarification resulting in the amendment. So thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it gives me great pleasure to move second reading.
Thank you. The motion is for second reading on Bill number 47, the Education Act. Is the House ready for the question? Question has been called. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye? Against? Motion carried.
Entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 1 of the Acts of 1995-96, the Education Act.
Order that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 51, the Revenue Act?
Bill number 51, the Revenue Act. The Honourable the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise in the House of Assembly today to introduce Bill 51, Amendments to the Revenue Act for second reading. And before I begin, I just would like to give credit where credit is due. And this actually was brought forward by staff to do best practices around this and to enhance making sure that we can move forward as a province appropriately. So this has actually come from staff, and I'm very proud of them for bringing this forward in this form for us. Mr. Speaker, the changes in Bill 51 will provide additional tools in the province's effort to combat illegal tobacco activity. The amendments we are proposing will apply in particular to people who use their vehicles in the commission of tobacco-related offences. Once a person is convicted of a tobacco offence involving the use of a vehicle, their driver's license, vehicle permit, or certificate of registration may be suspended. The suspension is for 3 months for the first offence, 6 months for the second, and 1 year for third and subsequent offences. Mr. Speaker, individuals who default on fines resulting from fuel or tobacco offences involving the use of a vehicle won't be able to renew their license or permit or transfer or register their vehicle. These measures will provide more incentives for people to pay the fines imposed by the courts for fuel and tobacco-related offences involving the use of a vehicle. In 2009-10, approximately $3.9 million in fines have been levied in Nova Scotia for tobacco-related offences. About $1 million of outstanding fines have been marked for write-off. However, we will continue our efforts to collect those debts. Knowing that high fines are imposed on people convicted of tobacco offences and knowing that the province is serious about collecting those fines is another deterrent for would-be smugglers. Clearer language in the amendments will allow the courts to impose more substantial fines for those who sell or transport illegal tobacco products, in addition to possession. Mr. Speaker, the combined measures will enhance Nova Scotia's ability to fight illegal tobacco activity. They are similar to laws passed in other provinces. It is important to fight the illegal tobacco trade for several reasons. The tax revenue lost to illegal tobacco could be supporting the programs and services that Nova Scotians want and need. Mr. Speaker, these enhanced penalty provisions will help us reduce the sale of illegal tobacco and the resulting tax revenue losses. This will, in turn, make life more affordable for Nova Scotian families. But tax revenue is not our only consideration, Mr. Speaker. We are thinking of the health of Nova Scotians. Nova Scotia's tobacco strategy has identified tobacco taxes and prices as a key element in reducing consumption of these harmful products. The illegal tobacco trade has an impact on the province's ability to effectively lower tobacco use among Nova Scotians. The tax revenue lost to illegal tobacco could be going towards funding health, education, and other important programs and services for Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, it is this government's hope that these new measures will help deter illegal tobacco activity, encourage the payment of fuel and tobacco-related fines, and improve the health of Nova Scotians. And Mr. Speaker, with that, I move second reading of Bill 21, the Revenue Act.
Thank you. The honourable member from Halifax, Clayton Park.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's my pleasure to rise and just say a few words on the Revenue Act, which is before us. It's Bill 21.
51.
Oh, sorry, 51. Thank you very much. Well, I was listening to the minister's comments on the bill, and it's certainly this embodies something that's very important to all of the legislature, and that is that first of all, that we collect when there are fines due, and that we do try to ensure that there is less illegal tobacco sales. Every year, when we look at the revenue of the province, and certainly some of it comes from tobacco sales and the taxes on that, there's a corresponding relationship to the underground economy and the illegal sale of tobacco. And I know that even setting the price of tobacco is we do it very carefully, because if it gets too high, we know that that encourages the illegal sale of contraband tobacco. And I was reminded just in hearing her comments of the court case where we have recently won as part of a national challenge to a couple of the tobacco companies for contraband tobacco. We've won a settlement of $12.4 million. I had asked the minister recently about that and whether the money had been received. And as you know, Mr. Speaker, that came because of a case that goes back many years, which involved the illegal sale of tobacco, and as a result, we were compensated. That money is needed in the coffers of the province to improve the health of Nova Scotians, to be put back into programs, and I had said specifically into tobacco cessation